All right, let's dive into today's news. We've got a lot to unpack, from possible ceasefire talks in Ukraine to a diplomatic row with South Africa to even a pretty scary airplane incident.
Yeah, there's a lot going on around the world. It's definitely a packed news day.
Let's start with the situation in Ukraine. There's been talk about a potential ceasefire, with Donald Trump calling his recent talks with Vladimir Putin good and productive. What's your take on that?
Well, it's certainly interesting. After that meeting between Putin and the U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, the Kremlin, expressed, cautious optimism, which is always a loaded phrase in diplomacy. And Trump, of course, went on Truth Social saying there's a very real chance this war could end.
But on the other side, we have Volodymyr Zelensky, and he doesn't seem too convinced. He's accusing Putin of basically trying to drag things out, setting up all these roadblocks to a real ceasefire. He even used the phrase endless discussions.
Right. Zelensky's worried about Putin playing for time, using negotiations as a cover while the war grinds on. And Sir Keir Starmer, he's echoing that skepticism, calling out Putin for not being serious about peace. He's even organizing a video call with other world leaders to try and get a peacekeeping mission going. Zelensky himself is calling for stronger action, particularly from the U.S., anyone who might be able to influence Russia.
So it sounds like we've got this real split between, some glimmers of hope for a ceasefire and a lot of suspicion that Putin's not actually acting in good faith.
Exactly. And then you've got the White House with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying they've never been this close to peace and that Trump's been putting the pressure on Putin.
But then there's this whole other wrinkle with Trump asking Putin to spare Ukrainian troops in Kursk. He's even talked about a potential massacre if things go wrong.
Yeah, that was a really charged statement. And then you have Putin saying that those troops are basically trapped and trying to escape, which Ukraine's military immediately denied. Putin's also said, if they surrender, they'll be treated with dignity. But it all just highlights how much conflicting information there is, how hard it is to get a clear picture of what's really happening on the ground.
And in the midst of all of this, you have the G7, who, according to Canada's Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, are on board with the U.S. ceasefire proposal. The U.K. Foreign Secretary David Lammy even said they're all pushing for a ceasefire with no conditions.
Which on the surface sounds great, but then you hear these reports of Putin laying down all these demands, and even U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is saying, look, this has to be done through proper channels, not just social media posts.
Oh, again, a mix of positive signals, but also some real potential stumbling blocks.
Right. And to add to that, we've got a separate report that goes into more detail about Zelensky's accusations. He's really convinced that Putin is deliberately trying to sabotage any chance of a ceasefire, setting these really tough conditions.
And once again, he's calling for the U.S. to step up and exert more pressure, basically saying they're the only ones who can really force Putin's hand.
Yeah, and Putin, for his part, is raising all these questions about what would happen during a ceasefire. Like, would Ukraine use the pause to mobilize more troops, retrain them, bring in more supplies? And then there's the whole issue of how you actually monitor the front lines to make sure everyone's sticking to the agreement.
Which Zelensky has said Ukraine can handle in the air and at sea, but they'd need help from the U.S. and Europe to keep an eye on things on the ground.
It's a logistical nightmare, frankly. And then you have the bigger issues that Zelensky brought up, that Russia fundamentally doesn't accept NATO expansion and Ukraine's sovereignty. Those are the really tough nuts to crack. Even if they can work out the practicalities of a ceasefire, those underlying conflicts are still there.
And the G7 has reaffirmed their support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, right to exist, all of that. But Zelensky's basically saying Russia's the only one who wants this war to keep going.
It's a very complicated and delicate situation.
Now, on a completely different note, let's talk about what's happening between the U.S. and South Africa. The U.S. is expelling South Africa's ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, which is a pretty major diplomatic move.
Right. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Rasool is basically not welcome anymore, accusing him on, X of hating America, hating President Trump, calling him a race-baiting politician. So, yeah, things have definitely escalated.
And it seems like this whole thing stems from some remarks Rasool made about the Trump administration, where he talked about a rise in supremacism and linked the MAGA movement to demographic shifts in the U.S. Rubio even went so far as to label him persona non grata.
Which, essentially means he's banned from the country. It's a really strong signal that the U.S. is deeply unhappy with him and, by extension, with South Africa. And you have to remember, relations between the two countries have been going downhill ever since Trump took office. He recently froze aid to South Africa, accusing them of discriminating against white Afrikaners, specifically citing their Expropriation Act.
And the White House has accused South Africa of targeting ethnic minority descendants of settler groups,
Hmm.
which is quite a mouthful. But the South African government, of course, denies all of that.
It's a very sensitive issue, and it's clear that there are some deep ideological differences at play here. And Rasul's personal history, being forcibly removed from his home as a child because of racial segregation, that's undoubtedly shaped his views on race and power.
This whole situation is really unusual. Expelling a senior ambassador like that, it
Right.
really shows how serious the rift has become.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears to domestic U.S. news, there was a lot of concern about a potential government shutdown, but that seems to have been averted. The Senate managed to pass a spending bill that will keep the government funded for another 6 months.
And it passed with some votes from Democrats, too. It seems likely that President Trump will sign it into law. But even though Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer ended up voting to advance the bill, he made it clear he wasn't happy about it, saying that a shutdown would be even worse.
Right, it was definitely a compromise. And of course, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't shy about criticizing Schumer for going along with it. She called it a huge slap in the face and argued that this bill just reinforces the cuts and the chaos.
Senator Ted Cruz, on the other hand, was very happy to see it pass. And Trump actually praised Schumer, which I guess is a sign of how desperate everyone was to avoid a shutdown.
Yeah, in the end, it seems like pragmatism won out over ideology. But it's important to look at what's actually in this bill. It keeps most of the funding at Biden-era levels, but there are some changes. It increases military spending by $6 billion, mainly for border security and veterans' health care. But it also cuts non-defense funding by about $13 billion.
There was a lot of worry about cuts to D.C.'s local budget, but it seems like that was addressed in a separate bill.
So, a mixed bag, but at least the government's lights will stay on for now.
Let's move on to some good news. SpaceX just launched a rocket carrying a new crew to the International Space Station. And part of their mission is to help bring back two astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, who've been stuck up there much longer than planned.
Yeah, they've been on the ISS for over 9 months because of some serious technical issues with their Boeing Starliner spacecraft. There were problems with maneuverability and even worries about propulsion risks because of helium leaks. NASA's been understandably anxious to get them home safely.
And this new crew, they've got astronauts from Russia, Japan, and two from the U.S. There's going to be a 2-day handover period, although there's a chance the return could be slightly delayed because of weather conditions for reentry.
We'll have to keep our fingers crossed for good weather. But in the meantime, Wilmore has already officially handed over command to a Russian cosmonaut. Williams, for her part, has said that the ISS is her happy place, but even she admitted that this extended stay has taken a toll.
It must be incredibly tough being away from home for so long, and all because of these problems with the Starliner. I mean, they went up there back in June 2024 to test it, and there were launch issues, docking issues. The whole thing was just plagued with problems.
In the end, NASA decided it was just too risky to bring them back in the Starliner. They're going to be coming home in SpaceX's Dragon capsule, which is obviously a bit of a blow for Boeing. They've insisted that the Starliner was safe to return, but NASA wasn't taking any chances.
There was even some talk from Trump and Elon Musk that they could have come back sooner, but NASA pushed back on that pretty hard. Dr. Libby Jackson, she was very clear that the priority was the astronauts' well-being, and the decision was based on solid technical and programmatic reasons.
It's certainly a relief to know that they'll be back on Earth soon. And speaking of people who need to be found, the search for Sudiksha Kanenki is still ongoing. She's the University of Pittsburgh student who went missing in the Dominican Republic during spring break.
Yeah, this is a really worrying story. She was last seen at her hotel on March 6th, around 4 in the morning, and so far there's just been no trace of her. The authorities are treating it as a missing person case, but they haven't ruled out anything, including drowning or foul play.
She was there with 5 of her friends on vacation in Punta Cana. Kanenki's actually an Indian citizen, but she's a permanent U.S. resident.
And from what we know, she and her friends were caught on surveillance video walking towards the beach, and at some point she stayed behind with one of the men in the group, Joshua Uribe, while the others went back to the hotel.
The Dominican president, Luis Abinader, said that Uribe told investigators a wave hit them while they were on the beach.
Uribe's parents have released a statement saying they're hoping for Kanenki's safe return and trusting that the investigation will be fair.
The search has been pretty extensive. They've been looking on land, at sea, using drones, even AI analysis of footage. But so far, nothing. They haven't found any signs of violence on the beach or anything like that.
The University of Pittsburgh is working with all sorts of agencies, the FBI, the DEA, Homeland Security, you name it. And Interpol has issued a global alert. Hopefully they find her soon. Now, in Canadian news, there's been a big change in leadership. Mark Carney has been sworn in as the new prime minister, taking over from Justin Trudeau.
First new prime minister in 9 years, actually. And one of the first things he did was address Trump's suggestion that Canada should just join the U.S. as the 51st state. He called that idea crazy and said it would never happen.
He also hinted that he might call an early election, too.
Which wouldn't be surprising. He's got a lot on his plate. And right off the bat, he made a big move by ending the consumer carbon pricing program, although the industrial carbon tax is staying in place.
It seems like he's trying to position himself as the guy who can deal with Trump, especially on those tricky trade issues. I mean, he does have a lot of experience in that area, having been the head of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England.
And he's already planning trips to the UK and France, so it seems like he's going to be hitting the ground running on the international stage.
Although he did say that he respects the U.S. and President Trump.
Of course, the diplomatic niceties have to be observed. But he also made it very clear that he's not going to back down on tariffs. He said Canada will keep those reciprocal tariffs on U.S. goods as long as Trump keeps his tariffs on Canadian goods outside of CUSMA.
And that's a big deal because Canada is really dependent on trade with the U.S.
Right. If those tariffs escalate, it could really hurt the Canadian economy. And politically, it's a minefield. Carney's main rival is Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, and the polls are suggesting that the race is going to be very tight.
Plus, you've got NDP leader Jagmeet Singh criticizing Carney's cabinet appointments, saying they don't represent progressive values.
So Carney has a lot of challenges ahead of him, both at home and abroad.
Now let's turn to the ongoing legal saga of Sean Diddy Combs. He's pleaded not guilty to an amended indictment, which includes some pretty serious new allegations about forced labor.
Yeah, the indictment claims that Combs forces employees to work really long hours under threat, and that he even forced at least one worker into sex acts.
His lawyers are denying those accusations about the forced sex acts, saying that it was all consensual, that it involved girlfriends, but they're vehemently denying all the charges in this federal case, which includes sex trafficking and racketeering. And then there are all the separate civil lawsuits, dozens of them, accusing him of rape and assault.
Which his lawyers are dismissing as attempts to get publicity. They're fighting this on all fronts.
And Combs appeared in court wearing a prison jumpsuit, with his family there to support him, his son, his daughter, his mother, even a friend. He actually seemed pretty upbeat, smiling, waving, blowing kisses to his family.
It's a very high-profile case, and it's only going to get more intense as it goes on.
There was actually a bit of a debate in court about a CNN video that seems to show Combs kicking his ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, back in 2016. His lawyers are claiming the video is misleading, that it's been edited to make him look bad.
And the prosecution, of course, is saying the video is crucial evidence.
The judge has basically told both sides they need to come to some kind of agreement about how the video is going to be used in court.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And in the meantime, jury selection is set to start on May 5th, with opening statements scheduled for May 12th.
It's going to be a long road ahead for Diddy. Shifting gears a bit, there was a lot of outrage recently over an incident involving a U.S. influencer named Sam Jones, who filmed herself taking a baby wombat from its mother in Australia.
Yeah, that sparked a huge backlash, even death threats. The Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, even called her out publicly.
Jones tried to defend herself, saying she was just trying to get the animals off the road and that the mother ran off, but the joey didn't, so she picked it up because she was afraid the mother might attack her.
And she insisted that it wasn't staged or anything, that it was a snap judgment. But then she also went on to criticize Australia's animal culling laws.
Which is a bit of a non sequitur, if you ask me. But anyway, wombats are a protected species in Australia, although you can get permits to cull them.
Right. And the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, he actually started reviewing Jones's visa, but it seems like she left the country before anything could come of that.
She's also known as Samantha Straubel online, and, no surprise, she deleted that wombat post. It just goes to show how quickly things can blow up on social media, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like wildlife.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about a concerning report from the UN about what's happening in Iran. They're saying that the government is using drones and digital surveillance to enforce the women's dress code and crack down on any kind of dissent.
They're basically encouraging people to inform on each other, right? Like using phone apps to report women who aren't properly covered in their cars.
It's a really chilling development. They're calling it state-sponsored vigilantism, and it goes beyond just phone apps. They're using drones and security cameras to monitor hijab compliance, especially in Tehran and southern Iran.
And the punishments can be brutal. Arrest, beatings, even rape in custody.
It's a horrifying situation, and this UN report comes after they already determined that Iran was responsible for the death of Mahsa Amini back in 2022.
That sparked a whole wave of protests, and it seems like the government is doubling down on repression.
Absolutely. They're saying that women have a civic responsibility to comply with the dress code, which basically means turning in anyone who doesn't. They've even installed facial recognition software at Amir Kabir University in Tehran to identify women who aren't wearing hijabs. And they're using surveillance cameras on major roads for the same purpose.
And then there's this mobile app, Nazer, which lets people report women who aren't covered in their cars. You can send in the location, date, time, license plate number, the whole thing. They even flag the vehicle online so the authorities can track it.
And the car owners get warning text messages, and if they ignore those, their cars can actually be impounded.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel. And the UN investigators who put this report together, they interviewed almost 300 victims and witnesses, and they found that the judicial system is totally rigged against women.
There's no independence, no justice. Victims of torture are being persecuted even further. Their families are being intimidated. And they even found evidence of extrajudicial executions of protesters, both children and adults, that are being passed off as suicides.
And there have been more cases of sexual violence in custody, including rape and gang rape. This report is going to be presented to the Human Rights Council on March 18th, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the international community does about it.
Let's hope they take some meaningful action. Now let's move over to Germany. There's been a big development there, with conservative leader Friedrich Merz securing a massive financial package for defense and infrastructure.
He's trying to put together a new government with the Social Democrats, and he wants to ramp up spending as quickly as possible. He even cited President Trump's stance on Europe as a reason for urgency.
Right. He had talks with the Greens, and afterwards he said this deal is a signal that Germany is back, that they're going to step up and play a bigger role in European defense. And he's really pushing to get these reforms passed before the new MPs from the far-right AfD party and the left party take their seats.
Because they could potentially derail the whole spending push.
Exactly. He needs a two-thirds majority, which he should have with support from the Greens and Social Democrats. There were actually legal challenges from the AfD and the left trying to stop the vote next week, but those failed. So it looks like this is going to happen.
So what's actually in this plan?
Well, it includes a huge increase in spending on defense, civil protection, intelligence, all of that. And that spending is going to be exempt from the usual debt restrictions. They're talking about spending over 1% of GDP on all of that.
Wow. That's a significant chunk of change.
It is. And then there's a 500 billion euro infrastructure fund that's going to be spread out over 10 years. And 100 billion of that is specifically for climate initiatives.
That's a big win for the Greens, I imagine.
Definitely. And they're also going to allow Germany's states to borrow more money up to 0.35% of GDP above the debt limit.
So they're really loosening the purse strings.
They are. And there's another interesting detail in those defense plans. They're exempting aid to states that have been attacked in violation of international law from those debt limits, which could potentially free up 3 billion euros in aid to Ukraine next week.
So this agreement is a big deal, not just for Germany, but for the whole region. It's a major shift in priorities, and it'll be fascinating to see how it plays out. Now let's go back to the Arctic, where Greenland's leading political parties have issued a joint statement condemning Donald Trump's behavior over his apparent desire to take over Greenland.
Yeah, this whole thing has been really bizarre. All the party leaders in the parliament came together to reject Trump's repeated statements about annexation and control.
This all stems from a meeting between Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, where Trump seemed to double down on his plan to annex Greenland.
And the outgoing prime minister, Mute Be a Jade, he's been really vocal about this. He went on Facebook and said, "Our country will never be the USA, and we Greenlanders will never be Americans. Enough is enough."
He really doesn't mince words.
Nope. And you have to remember, Greenland's been under Danish control for about 300 years, although they handle their own domestic affairs. The U.S. has a long-standing military presence there, with a base on the island. And it seems like Trump is mainly interested in Greenland's rare earth mineral deposits.
Right, but the way he went about it, talking to Rutte about needing NATO's help to seize Greenland, mentioning favorite players cruising around the coast. That really raised eyebrows. And then he just casually said, I think they'll happen, as if it's a done deal.
It was incredibly arrogant and disrespectful, and Root got a lot of criticism for not pushing back harder. He just said he didn't want to drag NATO into it, but praised Trump's concerns about Arctic security.
So it seems like this is one area where Trump is facing a united front against him.
The Greenlandic politicians made it very clear that they're united in their opposition to his plan. They said, Greenland continues the work for Greenland. We all stand behind this effort and strongly distance ourselves from attempts to create discord. And their statement came right after elections, where this center-right Democratic Party won a surprise victory, so it seems like this issue might have actually played a role in that.
Well, let's hope Trump gets the message and backs off.
Yeah.
Now, for a story that's closer to home, although still pretty frightening, passengers on an American Airlines flight had a really scary experience when their plane caught fire after an emergency landing in Denver.
Yeah, that was a close call. The flight was headed to Dallas, but they had to divert because of what they called engine vibrations.
All 172 passengers and 6 crew members managed to get out safely, but 12 people were hospitalized with minor injuries.
Some passengers said they heard a loud noise coming from one of the engines while they were in the air, and then after they landed, smoke started filling the cabin. Some people even had to exit onto the plane's wing to escape the smoke.
One passenger, Ingrid Hibbett, she was traveling with her family, and she said she saw flames and the windows were actually melting. And she was wearing sandals, which made it really difficult to get down off the wing.
It must have been terrifying. And to add to the stress, her family was seated separately, so they could only communicate by text.
It sounds like the whole thing was over in about 10 minutes, but I bet it felt much longer.
Yeah.
And even though they eventually made it to Dallas safely, the passengers were understandably shaken. They called it terrifying and exhausting and said it really overshadowed the start of their vacation.
I can only imagine. And one passenger said they were just grateful it didn't happen while they were still in the air.
Absolutely. Now, for our final story today, a Finnish court has sentenced a Russian national, Vojislav Tordin, to life in prison for war crimes committed in eastern Ukraine back in 2014.
Tordin was a senior member of a far-right mercenary group called Rusik, and he was found guilty on 4 charges related to an ambush that killed 22 Ukrainian soldiers and wounded 4 others. He was acquitted on 1 charge, though.
And this is actually the first war crimes case related to the conflict in Ukraine that's been heard in a Finnish court.
So it's a pretty significant case. Tordin, who was previously known as Jan Petrovsky, he was one of the founding members of Rusik, which is actually a subunit of the Wagner Group that's been operating in the Donbas region.
The charges against him stem from this ambush that happened on September 5th, 2014, where 21 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and 5 were wounded.
And they accused him of setting fire to their vehicles as well.
The court actually said they didn't have enough evidence to prove that Rusik was solely responsible for the ambush, since there were other groups involved. But they did find Tordin guilty of being in charge of the Rusik mercenaries, who killed 1 soldier and injured another.
And they also found him guilty of mutilating a wounded soldier with the Rusich symbol and then distributing degrading images of that.
The court even said that the killing was comparable to murder because of how brutal and cruel it was.
And even though he wasn't found responsible for all 21 deaths, he was ordered to pay compensation to the family of that 1 soldier who was killed.
Tordin has denied all the allegations and plans to appeal the verdict. His lawyer was really surprised by the ruling, saying there's no proof he killed the wounded soldier or gave any orders to do so.
But the Ukrainian prosecutor general called it a key milestone. And it's definitely a major development in the ongoing effort to hold individuals accountable for the atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine.
It's a very important case. Now, before we wrap up, there's one more story we need to touch on. There's been some serious flooding and landslides in northern Italy, with red alerts issued for Florence and Pisa.
Yeah, they've been hit with torrential rain in Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna. The president of Tuscany is urging everyone to be extremely careful.
They're saying Florence got almost a month's worth of rain in just one morning. And there have been reports of landslides and mudslides in Bologna, with some residents having to be evacuated.
Thankfully, there haven't been any reports of casualties yet. The worst of the flooding in Bologna seems to have passed by mid-morning.
But they did have to rescue a family of 4 from a landslide in Tuscany. And the fire brigade in Florence has been responding to tons of calls because the Romaggio River flooded in the outskirts of the city.
In Pisa, they've actually put up flood defenses along the Arno River because it's already past the first flood risk level.
And a lot of roads have been flooded or blocked by fallen trees. They're advising people not to travel in Florence if they can avoid it.
A lot of schools have been closed in Tuscany, over 60 municipalities, and some of the University of Florence campuses are closed too.
Florence has already gotten more than double its average rainfall for March, and that's just in the past 3 days.
And the red weather alerts for extreme flooding, they're going to stay in place for the rest of the day. They're expecting even more heavy rain and thunderstorms to move across northern Italy into Saturday.
So this is a really serious situation.
It is, and it's part of a larger pattern. Europe's actually the fastest warming continent, which means they're seeing more frequent and intense extreme weather events like this. And they're saying the floods that hit the same region back in 2023, which killed 13 people, were made worse by climate change.
It's a sobering reminder of the real-world consequences of climate change. Now, before we go, there's one last story we need to mention. Elon Musk's company, Tesla, has issued a warning that it and other U.S. exporters could be hurt by countries retaliating against Donald Trump's trade tariffs.
Yeah, this is interesting because, Musk has been pretty closely aligned with Trump, but Tesla sent a letter to the U.S. trade representative expressing their concern about what they call disproportionate impacts on American businesses because of these retaliatory tariffs.
And the timing of this is pretty interesting, too. This letter was dated the same day that Trump promised to buy a Tesla as a show of support for Musk.
Right, and Tesla's share price has been taking a hit lately, so maybe that's a factor, too.
In the letter, Tesla said that they're trying to localize their supply chain, but some parts are still really hard to source domestically.
And Trump just imposed this extra 20% tariff on all imports from China, which has obviously led to those retaliatory levies, including on cars. And China is Tesla's second largest market.
Not to mention the fact that the EU and Canada have also threatened to retaliate for those U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum.
It's a really complex situation, and Tesla's warning highlights the potential downside of these sweeping tariffs. It's not just about protecting American jobs, it's about the interconnectedness of the global economy.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of those Tesla takedown protests.
Right, where people have been targeting Tesla showrooms to protest Musk's role in the Trump administration.
And then, of course, Trump goes and calls those protesters domestic terrorists at an event where he's showcasing Tesla vehicles.
And then says he's going to buy one. It's all very Trumpian.
That's one way to put it. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. We've covered a lot of ground, from the conflict in Ukraine to diplomatic tensions and economic uncertainty. It's a complex and rapidly changing world out there, and we'll be back soon to break down more of the news for you.
Absolutely. Until next time.